Well, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. I am excited to start diving into Revelation with you guys. So I've been studying Revelation for a few years now, just have fallen in love with the book. It's probably become my favorite book of the Bible. And I just feel like the depth of Revelation is just incredible. Like there's just layer after layer after layer of things to learn and things to unpack. And so we're going to start by just diving way into the deep end. So tonight is, I think, fascinating information, but I think as we go through it, you'll understand why I thought this would be more appropriate for like a seminar type setting like this than a Sunday morning. This is pretty heavy stuff. We're just coming out of the gates, guns blazing here tonight. So couple things about that. We're recording this, so you'll be able to go back and check it out again later, and we're going to make the full transcript available for you. Because my guess is that as you start processing this, you're going to be like, okay, I need to look at this again, or I need to see some of those charts again. I still feel like this is kind of mind-blowing information. So just fair warning, that's where we're going. But I'm excited because I just think that the book of Revelation has so much to teach us about the Lord and his plans. So let's pray, and then we're going to dive in. God, thanks for your word. Thanks for a book like Revelation that has so much to communicate to us. And God, I pray that you would give us ears that would hear, minds that would understand. God, I pray that you would help us to grasp the intricacies that you put into your word. Lord, that we would know you better, that we would trust you more, and that we would live more and more for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Revelation math, what the numbers in Revelation mean. That's our title. Let's dive in. The book of Revelation is full of numbers. So some of the numbers you're probably familiar with. The number of the beast, 666, is probably the most famous. We also have 1,000 years, 1,260 days, 144,000 people sealed, 7 heads, 7 hills, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, 10 horns. You get the idea. There's a lot of numbers. John expected his readers to understand what these numbers meant. 2 key verses in Revelation prove that. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. This verse appears in the context of 666. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a person. Revelation 17, verse 9. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings. And John repeats the point because it's important. He expects his readers to have wisdom. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. Now, that Greek word translated wisdom could also be translated intelligence. Something more than surface level thinking is required to understand what's happening. It doesn't require great wisdom or intelligence to understand a surface level literalistic meaning of numbers. One of the reasons I believe the numbers in Revelation have deeper symbolic meaning is because the text of Revelation itself implies that deeper thinking is required to grasp the full implications of the numbers used in the text. John said it. So if we can agree that Revelation itself shows that numbers have deeper symbolic meaning, how do we understand what that deeper symbolic meaning is? Well, we need to start with a key understanding about the book of Revelation itself. Like here's kind of the big picture question. When we read Revelation, what kind of book are we dealing with? And Gerald Stevens, in his commentary on the book of Revelation, writes this, and this is going to be an overarching quote that I'm going to return to over and over and over throughout the next year plus as we go through the book of Revelation. Revelation is written to the churches, for the churches, and about the churches. This is a tremendously important point. So let's break down each of those phrases. Revelation is written to the churches. Imagine Revelation like a letter with the first chapter being the address on the envelope. Revelation 1:4 specifically is the address line. John, to the 7 churches in Asia. John identifies himself as the author, and he identifies the 7 churches as the audience. The book was written to 7 churches in late 1st century AD. Most scholars believe that the book of Revelation was written about 95 AD, and it was written to these 7 churches in Asia Minor. You can see that on the map, and it's interesting that the 7 churches actually are listed in circular fashion. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Look at that. Just kind of right around in clockwise order. That was who the letter was to. So, what's the implication of that? When we read Revelation, we're reading their mail. You know how annoying it is when you get an important letter, one that you've been expecting and looking forward to, and you know it's coming, and it arrives, and then somebody in your family opens it before you can, and you get this opened letter just kind of dumped out for you. Doesn't something inside you want to just scream? That's not your mail. Okay, here's my point. We need to stop reading the book of Revelation like it's our mail. It's not our mail. It's addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor in 95 AD. Now, by God's grace, the letter still exists for our instruction, for our encouragement, for our edification. But, key point, it's not written to us. Revelation was written to the churches. Revelation was written for the churches. John wanted to communicate specific messages to the specific churches. So if you know about the book of Revelation, chapter 1 is kind of an introductory vision of Jesus. And then chapters 2 and 3 are 7 addresses from Jesus himself to the 7 churches. Right to the angel of the church in Ephesus, right to the angel of the church in Smyrna, right to the angel of the church in Pergamum. And remember, on and on, around that circle it goes. One message for each of the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. Here's the thing. Each church faced different circumstances. Some of the churches were thriving. They were doing well, and they were to be commended. The church of Smyrna would be a good example of this, even in the midst of their poverty of persecution. Jesus said, "You're rich." Other churches were facing persecution, like the church in Pergamum. "You're holding on to my name and have not denied your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death among you, where Satan lives." Still others had grown lax. The church in Ephesus, you're probably familiar with that phrase, "You've abandoned your first love." You know that. Jesus had 7 unique messages. One message for each church. Of course, each church was supposed to hear and learn the lessons the other churches were receiving, but each church had a custom application. So, the vision or series of visions that John would unpack in chapters 4 to 22, the bulk of the rest of the book, had 7 different applications, one for each church. The letters front load the application of the vision. Some churches were to stand firm. Others, the church of Ephesus, were to return to their first love. Others were to resist false teaching. Still others, you're familiar with the church of Laodicea, were to stop being lukewarm. Remember that? You're neither cold nor hot. As we read Revelation, we need to filter our application. How do we understand Revelation in the 21st century? Through the lens of how the letter and vision first applied to each church in the first century. This is why I follow a type of reading of the book of Revelation called a redemptive historical reading. The book had a historical context, and it spoke of redemption won and accomplished in Jesus Christ and applied to each church. I reject a futuristic reading of Revelation, the idea that Revelation is primarily about future events. And here's why. It makes no sense for a letter to be written to 7 churches with specific applications front-loaded for those 7 churches, but then the content of the visions in the rest of the book to be, oh yeah, in 2,000 years or more, Jesus is going to do some pretty incredible things. How would that kind of vision encourage the 7 churches who first received the letter? How could it strengthen their faith if the only relevant application was, hold on, way after you're dead and buried, Jesus will fix things? I don't think that's what Revelation is about. To the churches, for the churches, about the churches. No, the vision itself must be something that applied directly to the churches. Revelation is called an apocalypse. The word apocalypse means unveiling. We need to understand Revelation as a different kind of unveiling. It's not an unveiling that's like a crystal ball showing future events as though you're reading a future edition of the newspaper. Rather, Revelation is unveiling true reality. The powers the churches saw on the surface, specifically the dominant Roman Empire, were not true power. Behind the scenes, John was unveiling that the Lamb was the true king, and the throne room of God was the true source of power. So if we want to understand the book of Revelation, we don't need a copy of Revelation in one hand and a copy of today's newspaper in the other, as though we can correlate today's headlines with Revelation's prophecies. No, John expected the people in 95 AD who lived in Asia Minor to have the wisdom and understanding to grasp his letter. We need to ask questions like, what would Revelation, this letter, have meant to them? How would they, the first audience, have understood it? That's how we can understand the letter as a whole. And that gives us a foundation on which we can start to make sense of the numbers in Revelation. So this Digging Deeper seminar is going to be a little bit different than Digging Deeper seminars I've done in the past. In past seminars, I've used lots of sources to help us understand the topic at hand. Tonight, I'm focusing primarily on just one source. Richard Bauckham is a leading New Testament scholar, and in 1993, he wrote 2 key books on Revelation. That was a productive year in his scholarship. The first book he wrote, you see the black book in the New Testament theology series, was a short book called The Theology of the Book of Revelation, just 165 pages. It was a textbook of mine in advanced Greek exegesis class at Moody, still considered to this day one of the best books written on Revelation. The red book is everything he wanted to talk about in his little book, but felt he didn't have room for. So the red book, The Climax of Prophecy, is a 400-plus behemoth of a book composed of 11 essays. I think the subtitle could be All the Other Stuff I Wanted to Tell You About Revelation. Our source tonight is the final chapter of that second volume. I consider it a mic drop kind of chapter. Bauckham explains how the numbers worked in the first century and what the numbers in Revelation meant. And I feel like once Bauckham tells us how the numbers worked and what they mean, The main interpretation work on the numbers is kind of done. He's done the groundwork. Here's the thing. Most of us, I'm guessing, including me, when I read that, I read that last chapter and I'm like, why has no one ever told me this? Like, this makes the book make sense. Every other explanation I've heard about the numbers has been like, that would mean nothing to those 7 churches. But when I heard this, I said, that actually helps me understand how these 7 churches would have read the letter. This makes sense. And the first thing you need to understand about first century numbers is a word. And in God's providence, it came up in John last week with 153 fish. One thing I did learn is that I've read this term for a long time, and I never bothered to Google how to actually pronounce it. So I stood up here last Sunday morning and realized as I was preaching, I have no idea how to say this word. We were talking about this in my community group last week, and they said, yeah, we noticed in first service that you kind of had this weird pause, But I learned something important in preaching class, which was if you don't know how to pronounce something, just fake it, because most people probably have no idea either. And so I very confidently said the word is gematria, which is not correct. The word is gematria. I Googled it so that I could get it right. Gematria, a method of interpreting scripture by computing the numerical value of words. Here's Bauckham, quote, since the letters of both the Greek and the Hebrew alphabets were all used as numbers, think Roman numerals, it is possible to add up the numerical value of each letter of any Greek or Hebrew word and obtain the, quote, number of the word. This, it is generally supposed, is what it would be to calculate the number of the beast. Let's use that as an example of gematria. Most scholars believe the number of the beast refers to the emperor Nero. Why do they believe that? Gematria. So this is just straight from Bauckham's book. I asked Lyle, I'm like, hey, can we make a really cool chart showing this? And Lyle's like, how about I just copy the page from his book, because it's really hard to get Hebrew on the screen. Said that's probably a fair point. So if you take Nero, here's what you get. This is the Hebrew of Nero Caesar. Those Hebrew letters include 4 letters for Nero, 3 letters for Caesar. The last letter is a second N, so it actually would have been pronounced using the Hebrew spelling, Neron Caesar. And in the Greek text of his name, it would have been spelled Neron Kaiser. Now, take the numerical value of those Hebrew letters. Bauckham lists it out for us, each letter. 50 plus 200 plus 6 plus 50 plus 100 plus 60, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you come up with 666. Now, here's what's really interesting. Some people didn't like Neron because they referred to him as Nero. Well, if you drop that N at the end of Nero Caesar, you'd lose 50 points. And then you would have 616 instead of 666. And what's really interesting is there were some copies, early copies of Revelation floating around that said, calculate the number of the beast because it's the number of a person. Its number is 616. Interesting. They had dropped the final N, and so they dropped 50 points. That's gematria. That's kind of like the building block. But John is just getting started. And this, my friends, is where it just goes. In 1912, scholars made a fascinating discovery. Quoting Bauckham, Ancient mathematics inherited from the Pythagorean tradition an interest in numbers conceived as corresponding to geometrical figures. Those corresponding to two-dimensional figures are known as plane, P-L-A-N-E, numbers. Three types of plane numbers dominate the book of Revelation: triangular numbers, square numbers, and rectangular numbers. We'll come back to that slide in just a minute, so don't worry about writing all that down yet if you're taking notes. Before I explain the concept and how it unlocks what the numbers mean in Revelation, I want to show my work, because you might be like, what is this? You might be asking things like, how can we know that John intended for us to read numbers like this? What's the historical proof? It's a fair question. We actually have detailed explanation of this type of numerical thinking from 2nd century, so 1 to 200 AD, mathematicians like Theon of Smyrna and Nicomachus of Gerasa. And we know that many of their ideas about plane numbers were known to Philo of Alexander, a 1st century guy. So it's fair to assume that educated people in 95 AD, the very end of the 1st century, would have known these principles. Remember John. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. Let the one who has understanding or intelligence calculate. So now let's explain what these plane numbers are. Then we'll explain what they have to do with the shapes they're named after. And then we'll tie it all together by exploring how John uses these numbers in Revelation. So triangular numbers, okay, ready? These are sequence patterns, triangular numbers. The sum of all successive numbers, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. Anytime you stop that sequence and add it up, you have a triangular number. Square numbers, the sum of all successive odd numbers. 1 plus 3 plus 5 plus 7 plus 9. Again, you can stop and add up the sequence at any point. Rectangular numbers, the sum of all successive even numbers. 2 plus 4 plus 6 plus 8 plus 10. Again, stop, add the numbers up at any point. Now here's where things get interesting. These numerical sequences can be written to look like the shapes they're named after. So check out triangular numbers. If you add up all the numbers in each triangle, you get the triangular number. So if you can see here, you have 1, then 2, then 3, then the 4th triangle. So there's 10 dots in the 4th triangle because 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 plus 3 is 6. 6 plus 4 is 10. 10 dots in the triangle. The sequence adds up to 10. Also, the outer side of each triangle adds up to the last number added to the sequence. The last number is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 dots on the outside of the triangle. The square numbers look a little bit different. The square numbers have some unique special properties that make them resemble squares. In fact, if you think of square as a math term, you think of things like square roots. That kind of gets you on the right idea. Like the triangles, you can add up all the numbers in each sequence to get the square number in the square sequence. Let's use the 4th one again as an example. 1 plus 3 plus 5 plus 7. 1 plus 3 is 4, plus 5 is 9, plus 7 is 16. But the side in the square number represents the square root of that sum. So the 4th square, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the side, the square root of 16 is 4. 3 is the square root of 9, 5 is the square root of 25, etc. Now let's look at rectangular numbers. They work a bit differently. rectangular numbers are a multiplication thing. So, for example, rectangle 2 has 2 rows of 3. 2 plus 3, or 2 times 3 equals 6. And then in the third one, 3 times 4 is 12, and 4 times 5 equals 20. You can imagine that these triangle, square, and rectangle numbers can expand out into quite long lists. In fact, we've got a chart from Baucham's book that you'll get to see in a little bit that goes out to 36 of these, because that's going to help you really understand what John's doing in playing with these numbers and these sequences. Not every number will be included in the triangle, square, or rectangle list. That makes sense, right? Like, not every number is going to be the sum of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, or 1 plus 3 plus 5, or 2 plus 4 plus 6, right? Like, the higher up you get, the less likely it is that a number is going to be included in any one of those numerical sequences. John occasionally used a number that was found on the list of plain numbers or sequence numbers. That'd be an interesting coincidence. But if almost every number he uses can be found on that list, well, we might have something intentional going on. And as we'll see pretty soon, that's exactly what John is doing. He's using numbers from these lists. So now, my friends, I present to you the expanded list of triangular, square, and rectangular numbers. We're going to come back to this chart a few times here this evening. But right now, let's math nerd out for just a moment and consider 5 additional properties of these numbers. Some of you will be like, I loved math in school. This is so interesting. Some of the rest of you are going to be like, what in the world? I promise you this has application to the book of Revelation. We will get there. But for our math friends, this is actually pretty fascinating. 5 rules. Here we go. Rule number 1. Every rectangular number is double its corresponding triangular number. Okay, let's just get the chart back up on the screen and look at this. For example, the 5th triangle is 15. The 5th rectangle is 30. The 6th triangle is 21. The 6th rectangle is 42. And you can do that for all of the numbers. Rule number 2. A square number plus its numbered place in the sequence equals the corresponding rectangular number. Back to the chart. Let's use square 5. Square 5, number 25, plus 5, its place in the list, is 30, the 5th rectangular number. Rule number 3. 2 consecutive triangular numbers equals the square number of that second number in the triangle list. Okay, example again. Triangle 4 is 10. Triangle 5 is 15. 10 plus 15 is 25. Square 5, see it up there on the chart, is 25. First century people, I think it's because they didn't have TV. I was just really pondering this as I was studying. I'm like, who sat around and thought up all these connections? And I'm like, well, what would you do without Netflix? Like, you have so much more time to do productive things. Okay. Here's where we really start to get some connections to the book of Revelation. Rule number 4. Some numbers can be double triangles. consider, and as you consider this, you're going to see immediately how it connects to Revelation, the 36th triangular number. You're like, why did he stop at 36? Because look at the 36th triangular number. 666. Here's what's interesting. 36, the number in the sequence, is itself a triangular number. So if you look at number 8 in the list of triangles, you get 36. Double triangular numbers are rare. Just for fun, I wrote them out for you. 1, 6, 21, 55, 120, 231, 406, 666, 1035, 1540. Those are the first couple. But you see, that's pretty rare. Rule number 5. Some numbers are both triangular and square. These are extremely rare numbers to be listed in the triangle list and the square list. Ready for the list? 1, 36, 1,225. There's your list. So get this. 666 is the triangle of 36, one of those incredibly rare double numbers that is both triangular and square. There's a lot going on in first century minds with the number 666. As soon as they see that, all of their math understanding is just going haywire in their minds. In fact, after 666, the next triangular number of a number that itself is both triangular and square is 750,925. My point is, this is a rare number that would have been a very special number in that culture. It would have immediately sent a buzz in them as they read it. All right, so that was a pretty intense trip into the world of math, plain numbers, and ancient gematria. Thanks for hanging with us. Here's the big question. What's the payoff, Pastor? What do all these connections mean? What does it show us about the book of Revelation? I'm going to try and keep this as understandable as I can. In fact, I think the best way to do that is just quoting Bauckham again. A triangular number represents the beast, the forces of evil at work in the world. A square number represents the saints. And for the third class of numbers, the rectangular, it seems appropriate that they designate this ambiguous period in which the beasts and the saints oppose each other. What's his system? Triangular numbers associated with the beast, evil, the forces working against Christ. Square numbers, the saints, God's people. The rectangular numbers, how long will this conflict go on? So now, we're going to give a few examples of this. Notice in Revelation chapter 17, verse 14, how many kings wage war against the Lamb. To understand this, you actually have to look back 2 verses, because it says in Revelation 17:14, these will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. In 17:12, it says, the 10 horns you saw. So how many kings are waging war against the Lamb? 10. 10 is a triangular number. allies of the beast are given a triangular number because triangular numbers represent the beast, evil, those who work against God's purpose. Notice that 10 is the fourth triangular number. John's playing with numbers. He's playing with connections here. The number 4 occurs a bunch of times in Revelation. What's 4 all about? How many corners does the earth have in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1? After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, restraining the 4 winds of the earth. We see a link between these 10 kings and the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds of the earth, and the 4 angels restrained in chapter 9 at the great river Euphrates. During the bowl judgments, the 6th angel blows his trumpet. And there's this announcement, release the 4 angels bound at the great river Euphrates. And then it says, so the 4 angels who were prepared for the hour, day, month, and year went out to kill 1/3 of the human race. That's strong. We can connect all that as well with Revelation chapter 16, verse 12. The bowl judgments in chapter 16 tying in with the trumpet judgments in chapters 8 and 9. Euphrates shows up again. Euphrates showed up in the 6th trumpet. It's going to show up in the 6th bowl. The 6th poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. The 4 destroying angels and the kings, we will find out in chapter 17, there were 10 of them, all tied together. These forces of evil, wanting to wreak havoc on the world. The coming kings are allies of the beast. They show up with the beast. And in Revelation chapter 19, the whole picture comes getting tied together. See, here's the cool thing about Revelation. John is just building. It's like a puzzle all being put together. And then you see towards the end, all the puzzle pieces coming together. In Revelation chapter 19, John says, then I saw the beast, the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and against his army. These 10 kings traveling across the great river Euphrates from the 4 corners of the earth. And Jesus Christ, the rider on the horse in Revelation 19, will destroy them with the sword that comes from his mouth and set up his kingdom. What's the point? These triangular numbers, these 10 kings, these 4 winds, these 4 corners of the earth, they've got nothing on Jesus Christ. Because greater is Jesus than anyone in this world. Second illustration for you. Notice that the beast introduced in chapter 13 has 10 horns. That makes sense because 10 is a triangular number, and triangular numbers represent the beast and evil. But what's interesting about this beast is not only does it have 10 horns, it also has 7 heads. And you may be saying, okay, so we've talked about all these numbered sequences. Where does 7 come from? Well, my friends, John is not just versed in gematria. He's also versed in the Old Testament. And when John is at his best, the creative genius of John as he writes Revelation is he's pulling together the first century context in the Old Testament. Did you know that the book of Revelation alludes to the Old Testament more than any other book in the New Testament? and yet it doesn't quote it a single time. He's constantly using Old Testament images, Old Testament numbers, Old Testament pictures. So let's talk about these 7 heads and the 10 horns. If we say the 10 horns make sense from first century gematria, it's a triangular number. It represents the beast. The 7 heads come from Daniel. In fact, you can look at it with me. Daniel chapter 7, verses 3-7. And here is what Daniel tells us in this vision he has of these beasts. Daniel writes, 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up, gorge yourself on flesh." After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads and was given dominion. So we see 4 beasts pop up in Daniel 7. The first beast has a head. The second beast has a head. The third beast has a head, right? So we're up to 3 heads. The fourth beast has 4 heads. 3 plus 4, 7. Where did John get his 7 heads of his beast in Revelation chapter 13? From Daniel. The people who were reading Revelation would have known Daniel. So the 7 heads and the 10 crowned horns link the beast of Revelation 13 with its master and source of power, the dragon. In fact, it says in Revelation 13, the dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority. So notice how both Old Testament precedents and first century gematria are combined in John's writing to show how this beast is both the fulfillment of evil prophesied in the Old Testament through Daniel and the symbolically numbered evil of gematria. A couple more illustrations for you of how this plays out. Let's talk about square numbers. Square numbers represent the saints. This gets very interesting. Let's go back to gematria. The numerical value of the word angel in Hebrew, I should almost have you guess, because as soon as you hear it, you're going to be like, oh, that makes sense. The numerical value of the word angel in Hebrew is 144. 144 is a square number. If we pull up John's big list again, you'll see that 144 is the 12th square number on John's list. Notice now Revelation chapter 21 and verse 16. Talking about the New Jerusalem. In Revelation 21, I think this is verse 17. We want verse 16. Revelation 21, verse 16 talks about the city is laid out in a square. Its length and width are the same. And then later on, he says, its length, width, and height are equal. An object that has equal length, width, and height is a cube. There's really only one cubed building in the Old Testament. It was the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. The New Jerusalem is laid out to be the new most holy place. Why? Because the most holy place is where you could go meet with God. It used to be that only the high priest could meet with God one time a year, but now the New Jerusalem is the most holy place. And it says, look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. In the New Jerusalem, everybody gets access, unhindered access to God, because the New Jerusalem has become the most holy place. Why do we need to have our robes washed in the blood of the Lamb and be made pure? Because we got to enter the most holy place where God is. The holy priest had to wash his robes to go into the most holy place. We wash our robes in the blood of Jesus so that we can go to the New Jerusalem and be with God forever. The number 12 is used all throughout the description of New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21. Bauckham explains it this way: whereas humanity debased to the level of the beast bears the triangular number 666, the mark of the beast put on people's foreheads or their hands, humanity raised to the level of the angels in the New Jerusalem is surrounded by the number 12. We see a wall in Revelation 21:17 that's measured at 144 cubits, square number. We see the sealed servants of God in Revelation 7:4 and Revelation 14:1. How many are sealed? 144,000. The triangular people have the beast's name written on their right head or forehead, while the 144,000, I love this in Revelation 14:1, the 144,000 have the name of the Lamb and God himself written on their foreheads. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And then, just in case you missed it, in Revelation chapter 22, talking about the New Jerusalem, John writes, they will see his face and his name will be on their foreheads. John's making a point. There's no middle ground. You're marked by someone. You've given your allegiance to someone. You either belong to the beast or you belong to the Lamb. And the book of Revelation is written to these churches saying, stand in your commitment to the Lamb, because you must pick a side. You either belong to the Lord or you belong to his enemies. Okay, another illustration for you. We just got two more. Illustration number 4. John uses 2 numbers to describe the duration of the end times period. How long will things go on? Remember, we said rectangular numbers were used to describe the duration of the conflict between the beast and the lamb. What are those rectangular numbers? Well, in Revelation 11:2 and Revelation 13:6, we see 42 months. But exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Revelation 13, verse 6. The beast was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That period was also described in Revelation 11:3 and Revelation 12:6 as 1,260 days. I'll grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, dressed in sackcloth. Revelation 12:6, talking about that great vision of the woman and the dragon, and the woman gives birth to a son. And then the dragon wants to kill the son as soon as it's born, but the child's caught up to God and to his throne. It says, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished there for 1,260 days. Triangular numbers. What happens during this time in between? Well, the beast attacks the saints. That's what the beast does in Revelation chapter 13. The beast was given a mouth to utter boasts and blasphemies. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It began to speak blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. And it was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them. It was also given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So the beast is attacking the saints. But while the beast is attacking the saints, God's protecting them. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. For how long? 1,260 days. What's the beast trying to do? He's trying to snuff out the church, trampling the holy city for 42 months. But what's the church doing? Giving witness. Remember chapter 11? Exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it. It's given to the nations. I'll trample the holy city for 42 months. Then all of a sudden, I'm going to give my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days. Just boom, boom. Satan's trying to snuff out what God's doing. God's continuing to speak through his people. And eventually, the saints win. John gets this vision of heaven in chapter 15. He says in verse 2, I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire. And those who had won the victory over the beast, its image, and the number of its name were standing on the sea of glass with harps from God. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. Because remember I said that John was using Old Testament and gematria? And John loved to use Daniel. So Daniel used numbers to talk about this era as well. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, he talks about this time where these beasts will attack God's people. And you see the two numbers he uses right up here on the screen? It's 1,290 days. And then it's 1,335 days, which begs a question. Why didn't John, who's constantly alluding to the Old Testament, stick with Daniel's numbers? And here's the answer. He wanted to use rectangular numbers. 42 is the sixth rectangular number, and 1,260 is the 35th rectangular number. These numbers all roughly equal about 3.5 years, 1,260, 1,290, 1,335. They're just a few days apart, maybe a month, month and a half. But John is modifying Daniel's numbers as though he's saying, yeah, this is what Daniel was talking about, but here's a new spin on it so that it makes sense in your context. Okay, last illustration. I think this one's cool. We've said that 666 is a doubly triangular number and that triangular numbers represent the beast. So the number of the beast being one of the few doubly triangular numbers should not surprise us. But here's where it gets interesting. Revelation 17, 9 to 11. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. So we're back to the verse we used to introduce this. What calls for a mind that has wisdom? He has this vision of this awful prostitute sitting on this ridiculous beast. The beast is covered in blasphemous names, and it's got 7 heads and 10 horns. He says the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain for only a little while. The beast that was and is not is itself an 8th king, but it belongs to the 7 and is going to destruction. So, the connection would have been super obvious to people in the first century because Rome, one of the nicknames for Rome was the city built on 7 hills. So when it says that the 7 heads are 7 mountains or hills on which the woman is seated, guess what? Everybody reads that and they're like, oh, that's Rome. But let me give a long quote from Bauckham. The number 666 is the double triangle of 8. To put the point in a perhaps more relevant way, 666 is the 8th doubly triangular number. So we got a new sequence. a sequence of doubly triangular numbers: 1, 6, 21, 55, 120, 231, 406, 666. So if you list out the double triangle numbers, 666 is number 8, which you need to know because it says the beast that was and is not is itself an 8th king, but it belongs to the 7. So John's playing with these sequences, knowing that this calls for a mind that has wisdom, that can calculate numbers in the way that first century people calculated numbers. We've noted that numbers of this kind were thought of in numbered series and according to their place in that series. Thus, Nero's number 666 not only reveals that he is the beast, it also, as the 8th doubly triangular number, reveals that he is the 8th and thus related to the 7 heads as an 8th. What's going on here? John's making use of the legend of the return of Nero. So Nero, did you know this? Nero offed himself. He committed suicide because he was such a wicked, evil man that they were going to depose him and impose some pretty harsh consequences on him, perhaps even execute him, because it came out some of the evil things Nero had done. So Nero decided he was going to flee the city, and he got as far as a suburb. I mean, it's like saying that he was in Minneapolis and he fled to Wayzata, and then he killed himself. But not a lot of people saw Nero's body. And so this legend emerged that Nero had actually fled to the east. And he was out there rallying an army. And he was going to come back with the kings from the east to take over. Well, now all of a sudden, Revelation 16 sounds a little bit more interesting when the great river Euphrates is dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east, with the beast whose number is 666, Nero. And then chapter 17 says it belongs to the 7, but it's an 8th, as though one of the 7 emperors was coming back as an 8th emperor. John's playing off their legend. He's presenting the return of Nero as a parody of the parousia, or return of Jesus Christ. Because in Revelation 17, verse 8, the beast who was and is not and is to come. What an interesting term, Revelation 17:8. This evil beast. And the angel's explaining to John in the vision, he says, the beast that was and is not and is to come. You're like, huh? Because that's language that was used of God in the throne room of Revelation chapter 4. The one who was and is to come. The beast is a demonic parody of God. 8 was already a big number in Christian thinking. You remember, as I've gone through John and I've talked about the 8th day being like the first day of the new creation. It's like the first day of the new creation week. So the Antichrist is attempting his version of a new creation. That's the idea. Here comes the Antichrist with these 10 kings across the Euphrates, and he's coming to claim dominion. He's going to use power and bloodshed and force to set up a new creation, because that's all Rome had. The peace of Rome was a misnomer, because the peace of Rome was, do what we say or we'll kill you. And so here comes Rome, looking as though it could be called what God is called, the one who was and is to come, but it gets unveiled as evil. It gets unveiled because it's the one who has killed the saints. It's the one who is calling people away from allegiance to God, saying, put this mark on you, the mark of the beast. It was Nero who wanted people to call him the Almighty. And how does John introduce Revelation? They had coins in the first century. And the coins said, Nero Pancrator, Nero the Almighty. How does John open his letter? I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, the one who is, who was, and who is to come. By the way, the Almighty. Sorry, Nero. Can't have that spot. It's already claimed. The seven heads, interpreted as seven kings, represent the complete series of evil anti-Christian rulers of Rome. How can there be an eighth? Perhaps because he is one of the seven, recurring as a kind of final excess of evil. In Nero, that completeness becomes excess evil. But in John's use here of numbers 7 and 8, a seventh, but yet an eighth, he's also playing on the Old Testament. The graded numerical saying of Proverbs 6:16 to 19, where the numbers 7 and 8 are used. And you see, there are 6 and 7 things that the Lord despises. So let me clarify that. The number 6 and 7 used in the Hebrew, but it's showing that it's like this gets piled up on top of this, as though it's the complete excess of as much evil as possible. So in Proverbs, it's 6 and then 7. In Revelation, it's 7 and then 8. When the number 7 and 8 are used in this way, they seem to indicate an indefinite but adequate number. It's used in the Old Testament also in Micah chapter 5 and verse 5. He will be their peace. When Assyria invades our land, when it marches against our fortresses, we will raise against it 7 shepherds, even 8 leaders of men. 7 and 8 are an indefinite but adequate number for things to be resolved. Here's what John's saying. I don't think John actually believed that Nero was coming back. I think he was playing on the idea that Nero was coming back to say this. Here's where you're at in the sequence of human history. You're in between number 7 and 8. Lots of ink has been spilled trying to figure out who the emperors in Revelation 17:10 were. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the next has not yet come. When he comes, he must remain for only a little while. Commentators don't really agree on who this list of emperors are, because there was a civil war in the middle of the first century in Rome, and there was a year with 4 emperors, and commentators aren't sure if he included those 4 emperors who lasted only a few months. And so everybody's got their own list. Well, maybe he started with Augustus. Maybe he started with Tiberius. Everybody's trying to figure out who these emperors are. And here's the thing. The people who got the letter knew. And we can content ourselves with that, because Revelation is their mail. John was saying, at some point, Jesus is going to return. And all the evil anti-Christian rulers and emperors are going to run their course. And their excess of evil is eventually going to snuff itself out. It's fascinating in Revelation chapter 17. These 10 horns and the beast end up hating Rome. And it has some pretty strong language in Revelation chapter 17. It talks about they'll make her desolate, naked, devour her flesh, burn her up with fire. Like the forces of evil are just going to turn in on each other. And they're going to bring about their own destruction. But then there's Jesus coming on the white horse. And he wins. What Revelation 17:10, this is Bauckham, what Revelation 17:10 is intended to tell his readers is how far they are from the end of the sequence of 7. It tells them there's only one short reign to go before the end of Roman imperial dominance of the world. It tells them, as Revelation frequently does, that the end is near. Hold on. Jesus is coming. How long do they need to wait? Revelation 6:11 tells us, a little while. They were each given white robes, and they were told to rest a little while until the number would be completed of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been. And friends, that is really John's big point. Every human power, military power, kingly power, every power has met its match in the true and coming King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he's going to reign for 1,000 years. John uses 1,000 years. It's not a triangle number. It's not a square number. It's not a rectangle number. It's just a magnifier of immense proportions. 144 was multiplied by 1,000 to become 144,000. 1,000 years is shorthand for forever. Because in the end, Jesus wins. And that's the message of the book of Revelation. He's using all these symbols and all these numbers to make a really simple point. Jesus wins. Stick with him. There's going to be a lot of pressure to go be on Team Beast. Don't do it. Because Jesus wins. And when he shows up, those with him are called chosen and faithful. Stick with Jesus. Because when he wins, the armies of heaven follow him on white horses wearing pure white robes. Stick with Jesus because you can be in the New Jerusalem and have unfettered access to God forever. Like every spiritual blessing is yours in Christ. Stick with him through this short time where the earth will be in cataclysmic upheaval. And that's why the book of Revelation is so applicable to every generation. Because every generation has its own upheaval. And we can look at their mail and say they could stand firm. Because in a little while, Jesus returns and his people win. And we can read that and say, man, it feels like we're in upheaval too. Hang on. Because in just a little while, he's going to return. And he wins. And that is the message that calls the churches to stand firm, reconnect with Christ as their first love, and to live pure, holy lives as we wait for his sure and certain coming. There you go. The numbers in Revelation. I hope that's, thanks. You're very kind. I hope that whets your appetite for what's coming. Because we're going to break it down verse by verse over the next many months. Let me pray for us and we'll wrap it up. God, thank you for your word, for the depths that we can see in it. God, it's mind-blowing. There's so much there. But God, when we get a glimpse of the greatness of Jesus Christ, it causes us to want to cling to him. May we do that. When we're tempted to reject and walk away from Jesus, to be part of the evil world system, God, help us to stand firm because you win. Thanks for this awesome, incredible book that we can read and learn from what you said to these 7 churches. Help us to grasp that message and to stay firmly connected to you. In your name, amen. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming. We'll see you again soon.